All right. Well, good morning or good afternoon, whatever your case may be. I'm Rebecca. I'm the field CTO at Swarmia, and I'm here with Otto, the founder and CEO of Swarmia. So, Swarmia, if you haven't heard, is a platform for helping engineering organizations be more effective. And so, we're not going to talk about that too much today. What we actually want to talk about is software engineering at startups. Software engineering organizations go through a lot of phases as they grow and the company achieves more success and gets more customers and gets more code and gets more people. But one thing that has to be constant is that whatever worked before doesn't keep working forever. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today is just the different phases that startups are going through, that startups tend to go through, especially around the engineering function. Um, so let's start out by talking about what's unique about doing, and maybe before I ask you this, you should say a little bit about like why are you qualified to talk about this? So
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for joining. I feel like I have a tendency of going back to the beginning. So every time I've built something, I've ended up starting anew. So I've done startups, for example, Flowdoc in the team collaboration space. Then I joined an angel investment of mine, smartly.io, to scale the engineering function. And then again, I went back to the beginning to start Swarmia. And overall, we've achieved product market fit in all of these companies. And for example, at Smartly, we launched multiple products during this time. So even as a more established company, you still have to go back and figure out product market fit as you reach out to new audiences or build something drastically different from your existing product. So I've done this several times. The reason I love B2B SaaS is because it's one of the more predictable areas of business. So if you're good at selecting your early customers and you're good at listening to their input and delivering products for them, then you're eventually going to get at least close to a product market fit. It's difficult to say how long it's going to take, but that's kind of my context and perspective for this discussion.
got it. Yes, and I have certainly learned a lot about all of this from working with you. So, yeah. Well, what is you just mentioned some things, but what is unique? Like, why is this a topic? Why is this different from jumping into an engineering organization at a more established company? What's unique about building this function at a startup?
Yeah, startups are definitely unique, and I think one of the failure modes is just reading what everyone's doing online, doing a lot of microservices and Kubernetes and all the scaling things that the great companies are doing, and then expecting that that's exactly what you should be doing at a startup. And ultimately, what's important for a startup is getting to that product market fit, because without it, nothing else matters. And so it's a very binary outcome in a sense that if you can't get a product out to the customers and can't build something that retains those customers and something that people enjoy, then none of the other things matter. However, this is, of course, something that you're constantly going to be balancing, because it's not as if you're just quickly hacking together something one day. And then when you prove success with your MVP, then suddenly you'll get time to rewrite everything and you're going to start from scratch and it's going to be an amazing technical implementation for it. Like, that's not going to happen. That has never happened in the history of startups. So when you build something, you're going to keep building on top of that. So you're going to have to try to be a little bit strategic about, well, when is the right time for us to introduce this process or invest in this part of the platform or something else. So that's definitely unique about startups, that there's a very clear and urgent priority around the product market fit. And there's another dynamic that is around the funding. So you really do have to worry about funding, and you have to consider that as part of when you consider your time horizon for some of these investments. So if you are just starting something new and you don't have any customers, you don't have anything, and you have no funding, but you have money in the bank account to survive for 3 weeks. Well, at that point, you're not going to invest in moving to Kubernetes. That's pretty clear. So you have to consider the funding element when you choose your goals and what's realistic, what's achievable, and then that should inform what's stage appropriate for the solution. And so Of course, the answer is for stage appropriateness is that, well, it always depends, but that's kind of one of the topics that I think would be useful to discuss today.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious, going back to the funding, how has that affected your decisions about who you hire into the engineering organization? You know, if you have $100 and you can buy two software engineers at $50 each or one at $100, how do you think about those first hiring decisions?
Yeah, there's of course different philosophies, and I think you can see companies build successfully with different types of approaches. It seems to be that the founder or the founding tech lead or whoever kind of tends to set a tone for who are the people we're going to hire. And so when I started my first company at the age of 18, our average age was 18. So that's
Mhm.
kind of what you end up getting at that point. And then, of course, now a bit later, starting companies, the average age is already like 30 plus. So that happens quite naturally. And that correlates with seniority, although it's, of course, not the same thing. And so,
Sure.
overall, in the beginning, I really like trying to hire generalists because in the beginning, you don't know what exactly this company is going to be doing. And so if you have people with extremely narrow areas of responsibility or expertise, then that might just rule out a lot of the directions that would be good for the company. But those people might not want that for their own career. And
Mhm.
so I was just talking to someone who was starting her first startup and was hiring Harvard machine learning PhDs for the first engineering roles. And if you don't need that, like if you're not building self-driving cars or something else, that's most likely way too much specialization in a topic that is not the solution to all of your
Right.
problems. So at Swarmia, actually two of the first engineers were both from the business school background, so they had
Mm,
more of business context, and they were both actually pretty late in transforming their career to tech. That didn't
mm,
make them any worse developers. They were excellent. They have been excellent developers, but they also had some context that someone who focused on engineering for the whole career might not have. And this is partly just the character thing. So
mm,
there's plenty of developers out there who are very customer oriented and who are very full stack and who understand everything. And then there's people who think about it more from the perspective of, I want to develop deeper expertise in this one particular area. And those people definitely have a place at your company, but it might
mm.
not be the first engineering hire.
Right. Right. And well, we'll talk a little bit more. I'm really curious to hear about how the hiring strategy evolves over time, because that first hire is critical. That first engineering hire is probably like a very special, uniquely picked person, but you can't do that for hire, 100 or something like that. You can still be discerning, but you probably can't get 100 of those first engineers to join you over time. So maybe let's talk about, like I said, one of the things I want to talk about is in this conversation is just how things change over time and how things stop working that used to work. So maybe we can talk about that in the context of Swarmia's journey. What have you seen? What was the right time to do a whole variety of things, from CI/CD, hiring the first manager, moving to microservices, Kubernetes. How did all that play out at Swarmia?
Yeah. So first of all, everything here is very journey dependent in a way. So, um, kind of whatever is your background is going to influence a lot of these decisions. And me being a solo founder at Swarmia also meant that I had to start outsourcing many of these responsibilities relatively early, because even though I might consider myself to be an okay engineering team lead, but also it's not the thing that I necessarily have to be doing for the business, because we also
Mhm.
had to care about marketing and sales and everything else.
Mhm.
So I also had to do that relatively early. So maybe a couple of milestones. So when we started building this, it it was just me and two developers, and all of us were writing code. And so our first idea, and again, this is where the funding horizon comes in. We had just raised €1 million at the time, so we knew that we had money for 1 year plus. So we have time
Mhm.
to prove something. And so because we're building this data driven product, we knew that there's only as much that we can validate by talking to customers. At some point, we're going to have to show them some data and ask
Mhm.
them what they think about it. So we have to build the product to some degree. And before starting the company, I talked to about 30 customers to ask them about how they are currently doing things and trying to understand the market. And so that produced some learnings, but also I could clearly see that this market doesn't exist yet. No one's actively thinking about this problem space. They do have the underlying problems, but they might not be able to connect those problems to what I'm presenting. So that was a bit of a leap of faith.
Yeah, and just for context, that was so Swarmia is about to
2019.
turn, yes, Swarmia's about to turn 5, so that was 2019.
Yeah.
So a very different economic context and business context than we have today.
Yeah.
So that's been interesting for me to see how, yeah, these things that were, people were curious about them maybe around then, 2017, 2018. But yeah, seeing the demand for this, how the economic state of the world has kind of changed the demand for this sort of software has been really, really interesting.
Yeah, the
Um,
driver definitely changed. So initially, it was due to the scale. You start to think about how do I understand the slowness that emerges in different parts of the organization, and how and so that was the original value prop. And then later, it's more about I can't hire developers anymore. So how do I ship more as I keep getting more and more pressure from upwards? So it's changed a little bit. It's actually made this whole product maybe even more valuable because it's now more urgent than what it was before.
right, right. So I've been with Sarmia for 2 of those 5 years. So there's a lot that I missed, which is why I'm asking all these
Hmm.
questions. So there's a lot that I missed. But how did we like when you were getting started? You had a very technical sounding team, right?
Yeah.
Because you, like you said, you're writing code, you're hiring developers to write code, and then you're maybe outsourcing some of the non-technical things for a little while till you hire for them. But um, how would you how would you advise maybe a non-technical founder about those first engineering decisions?
Yeah, it's important to understand that this is not some kind of a deliverable. It's not a project. It's nothing like that. It's fundamentally a way to think about tech as a solution to some of your business problems. And so that is the reason why everyone's pushing you to have a technical co-founder, because it's fundamentally a different way of thinking. And I see this all the time when I work with sales teams and marketing teams, that people don't always realize that this thing could be automated. And developers are by nature often a bit lazy. They, if they see something repetitive, they do want to automate that. And so that's a very fundamental thing. And so it affects how you can even reason about different questions. However, it's also interesting with the rise of the AI tools how much you can actually learn yourself. And I've seen a lot of founders who actually they just chat a ton with their AI assistant of choice, and they ask a lot of questions, and they are even good at this strategy level questions. And then you can move all the way to implementation and so on. So these tools are available for all of us. So that's definitely a big plus for someone who's building their first startup, because ultimately, to attract the best possible technical talent to your startup, you're going to have to bring something to the table. It's not enough to say that, hey, I have an idea, because there's a lot of people out there who are saying that they have an idea, and there's a lot of tech people who get approached by many of these people all the time. So the more you can validate it yourself, if you can get some customers, if you can build a community around your idea, if you can raise some funding for it, which might be difficult if you don't have the tech talent already on board, those are all things that you should try to do at that stage. And sometimes you just have to do it gradually. Maybe hiring a CTO is not realistic at the stage where you are, and maybe just getting to build some kind of a initial product with more of a developer is the right way to go
Mhm.
at that stage. So I would really try to keep the options open, and then just try to find all the help, both from AI assistants as well as from anyone else you can connect with in your networks.
So, what was when were just three of you? I imagine processes were pretty lightweight. How has process evolved at Swarmia over the years? And so, just we have several engineering teams now, far more than two engineers, um, and a lot of that growth has happened over the last 2 years. But yeah, what did you feel like was essential as far as process when you were first getting started, and where did you find you had to introduce process as we grew?
The funny thing about process, and I'm a bit of a process fan myself. I
Mhm.
study these things all the time. I'm really curious about how it works, and yet like we're also pretty intentional about how we run everything at Swarmia. So actually, since the first week when we started working on this, we had a bunch of recurring meetings and just kind of a way of running this. So we started by having, first of all, a daily stand up that would be focused on just the work that we're doing. Then we had Friday demos since the very first week, to show what we've built. And it's also a way for us to kind of critique that and just give feedback about the features and make small adjustments and so on. And then we have also had bi-weekly retrospectives since the very beginning. And we also, in the beginning, we also had a weekly Monday kickoff that was more of a look at the business and sharing everything about what have been we've been talking about with customers and so on. Although, of course, whenever we had a meeting with someone, we just shared the meeting notes immediately in Slack and just made sure that everyone in the team sees that and so on. But that's the process we had in place since the very beginning. And after that, what happens quite naturally is that initially every feature is just one user story, or it's like a
Mhm.
small spec. Let's add this kind of a view. Okay, here it is. And it's very easy to do. And at some point, you realize that things are just taking longer. And if you keep splitting the work the same way that you did, it's just going to take months now instead of that couple of weeks. And so at some point, you're going to have to go back and see, well, do we need to have another somehow layer of talking about bigger projects, and how do we work on them? How do we define them? When you start getting more customers, you want to make sure that you're not just reacting to one customer's feedback, but you're taking a balanced view of across all of your customer base. So I would say most of our process developed around um, both the product direction and the strategy around it and everything else. And then maybe some coordination across the engineering team, as we now went to 4 different engineering teams. So that's maybe the biggest part. And so now, for example, we document company strategy to a Notion page, or a collection of pages actually. And that's kind of where we talk about what are we seeing in the market, uh, what do we think is the right sequencing for this, what do we think is the right operating mode for us as a company at this stage, because it might be different than what it was in the previous stage. And then we break that down to objectives. I'm sure everyone's heard of OKRs, objectives and key results, and
By
so
now,
on.
yes.
And I know we with Rebecca, we have a slightly opposing views sometimes on how to run OKRs, but um, we're doing them at the company level mostly, and we're not at a place where, for example, we would need to do a lot of stuff at the team level separate from that.
Mhm.
So it's still a pretty lightweight process that we run, but that's kind of roughly the evolution.
Yeah, we can have an OKRs fight another day.
Yeah.
It's okay. Yeah. Strong opinions, loosely held. So, on the tech side, we talked about introducing process, but on the tech side, when is, again, you've got three technical people sitting in a closet or wherever you guys were at first, and are you setting up CI/CD? Are you setting up automated testing? Are you set like how are you deploying, and how much thought are you putting into those decisions on day zero? And what of the, you've mentioned Kubernetes several times, like maybe that's something that you can put off for a while, but what are the things that are kind of table stakes when you're getting started, and the things that actually worry about them later?
Yeah, this is maybe where my takes are gonna be more controversial than before. So for CI and overall philosophically, I think if you know that your time horizon is a bit longer, like I was explaining, we had money at least for a year, probably for two, and we knew that we're going to build some kind of a product. We're not going to just validate this with mockups. We're going to actually have to build something that gets used by customers. So we knew that this is going to be the product that gets expanded on over time, and this code base is going to have a life of several years.
Mm,
So we felt pretty strongly that we want to make sure that whatever we build actually takes us to the right direction and not to the wrong direction. Because if you completely ditch automated testing and everything else, then there is going to be a day when someone brings it up and you start working on it. And at that point, doing the code archaeology to understand what does this even do, that is just a lot more mental load. And sometimes that might be the only viable option if your funding situation is such that you just cannot potentially invest any time in doing
mm,
that. But in our case, when we knew that we had a couple of years, CI/CD was actually the first thing we did. Like after talking to 30 customers, having the team start, then the first thing was, okay, well, let's build a pipeline so that whatever we do, it ends up in some kind of environment so that we can start showing it to people. And so we built the whole automated testing and CI/CD pipeline in the first week or two, and we're still running that same thing. And it has meant that from the very beginning, we have shipped code to production like 10 times a day at least. So we've been doing that all this time. It reduces a lot of risk. This is one of the things I've definitely seen in many software organizations, that there's so many, it's so difficult to quantify the friction caused by these bad tools that companies don't often then end up fixing it, even though for developers it's usually pretty obvious that this is a big source of friction and I'm spending most of my day fighting with this. And so we even went so far that, like in the automated testing, we did, for example, consider like how do we generate test data, because I knew that that's always going to come up as an issue.
mhm,
And how do we test database code? Like how do we write integration tests in a way that they don't interact with each other, and so that they're
mhm.
reliable and they're also fast and so on. And we did spend an extra hour or two on each one of those problems and made sure that we have a solution for that, because otherwise already in the very beginning you're going to have people coming up with their own solutions for how
Right.
do I generate test data. You're going to have one developer who's going to just hard code it in the test, and you're going to have one
Mhm,
developer who's going to use it from like just some other data that they found
mhm.
lying
Right.
around. And so there's definitely a standard that we set for ourselves when we built this originally. And I think it was a very good move. It has definitely saved us a lot of time. And so, in that sense, I think investing in CI/CD has been a very good move for us. And I've seen
Well,
people, and
it's
I've interviewed developers where the CEO told a company of 30 people that we're not ready yet to write tests. And so it's funny that like that's the other end of this
right.
spectrum, and I think we're in a better place thanks to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the urge is not to set up CI/CD. The urge is to build a feature and show it to somebody. But I think it's cool. It's something that's so different from, say, 10 years ago, is you can just pick CI/CD up off the shelf, and you can just pick automated testing up off the shelf. There's less, there's still stuff you need to figure out, but there's a lot less to figure out than there used to be.
Mm.
And you can, in many cases, just click some buttons and write a config file, and you have a deployable application. Um, so I am on your side, and getting this stuff in place early is the right. It's so hard to do later, and the smoothness that it produces. Like I click a button and I know I can see what I just did. Um, that I can't imagine moving forward without that, because it does reduce so much friction. And that's also where I come back to, like, you're 18, you're I will say, I don't want to talk about age, but like you're a developer with 0 years of experience, or experience from like hacking stuff in high school, may not uh, say we need to build CI/CD on day one, right? That is that point of view kind of comes from maturity and experience to realize that you actually want to get these things in place. So I think something that we've done like exceptionally is just the caliber of the engineers that we've hired, so that there was no argument about whether, oh, I don't know, maybe there was an argument, but the argument was philosophical, not you know not
Yeah.
like we're not ready.
Yeah, indeed. And maybe for extra context, since we talked about recruiting a bit earlier, um, most of the team members we hired have been like a staff engineer or a CTO or something like that before. So the early team was extremely experienced, even to a point where we had discussions of did have we taken this too far? And I remember that being brought up at some point, because also um, it can easily lead to overemphasis on like some theoretical discussions of what could
Sure.
be going wrong. So it is really critical to have that as part of your culture, to still keep the focus on the customer, and like we actually have to move forward. So there's no time to spend on like forever fights. But I mean,
Right.
it happens with the more junior team, because I faced this when I joined Smartly. We had an ongoing argument about how to indent code. Like, is it going to be tabs or spaces? And I'm like,
Right.
well, I don't really care. But the one solution that is not okay is that you indent with tabs and you indent with spaces, and then you go and like change each
Right.
other's code all the time. So, like, everyone's going to have some kind of arguments, but the organization needs to be pretty good at solving those and moving on. And the type of people you have is definitely that contributes to what type of discussions you're going to be able to even have.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about kind of the beginning, and decisions to make and not make in the beginning. um, let's talk about what is the point where you where there became an engineering team. Would you say there always was one and you were just on it for a while? Or like how do you think about teams and how teams evolve over the concept of team evolves over time?
Yeah, I mean, initially the company is the team. That's kind of when you start a startup. It doesn't matter which function you are. You're like, it would be weird to exclude that one salesperson
Right,
from all the company meetings, because we talk more about the product. Plus, in the early days, it's not really sales. Half of it is product management. You're kind of gathering
right.
feedback, and you need to understand the product at that level. So initially, we had all company everything. So all of these meetings that I listed, they involved everyone. And so the team grew after the first developers. We had our first designer. Roman was pretty early. He's currently our head of product. And so like we started bringing some non-developer perspectives pretty early, but then it was mostly developers until we brought our first customer success managers to work with customers. And that was maybe a year after, like we already at that point had the paying customers, and we had a bunch of things going on. So that's kind of when we started bringing in some other roles. But initially, it was mostly the whole company. Then, of course, at some point, it ended up being like sales and customer side, and then engineering on its own, kind of running these processes. And and then, of course, at some point, you start growing out from a single engineering team. But pretty much every time we kind of highlighted, and since our people were so experienced, everyone kind of knew the dynamics around these teams. So everyone already kind of recognized that okay, when there's going to be daily stand-ups where like I'm zoning out because I don't really care about that problem, that's a signal that this is really not one team anymore, but this is actually multiple teams sitting in one daily stand-up. So um, that's kind of what we were looking for. We also were pretty proactive about talking about it. So we kind of always said that the next stage of growth is going to look like this, and these are some of the signals we're going to start noticing. And then it was kind of obvious to everyone that okay, now would be the time to start thinking about maybe splitting this team.
Right. And how what are your thoughts on team size? I've heard of teams of 25 engineers, and that's not my notion of an engineering team, but what are your thoughts on team size?
Yeah, I think the common wisdom holds for the most part, but then when you go through a transition and when you're a fast growing startup, then there's some exceptions that I think are pretty important. So of course it's nice if your teams are, let's say, 4 to 5 to 6 people, like that's very manageable. If you optimize the team experience, that's probably optimal. You have enough people to have different perspectives brought in, and even if someone's out, it doesn't mean that the whole team disappears.
Right.
So that's nice, but also you don't have that coordination overhead. But then when you're, for example, going from one engineering team to multiple engineering teams, that's kind of my one of my favorite problems, because
Mhm.
it's so painful in that in those early days, and it's even culturally challenging when you've all been one team, and some companies
Mhm.
already like publish some slogans that okay, we're all one team and like this is how our
Mhm.
culture works and so on. And then you realize that, well, being one team was maybe just a characteristic of us being a small company, and now we
Mhm.
have to do make some kind of a changes, because the problems are also obvious. Like I already mentioned that you're zoning out in a daily stand-up because you just don't care about some part of the things that your team is building. But overall, just the complexity that you're dealing with is going to increase. Like you're going to have to be an expert on this part of the tech stack and this part of the tech stack and so on. However, when you're making that shift, I think it's actually really important to try to build as much of that cross collaboration capability as possible, because you're building the foundation for your engineering org to scale. And if everyone roughly knows what the other teams are doing, then it's going to make it a lot easier for them to collaborate with those other teams. And of course, this is a capability that disappears over time, because when your original engineers are leaving the company and new engineers are joining, they are never going to have that exact same journey as you had when you were part of that one big team. But we've had like we've only lost one of our engineers, and he went on to
Mhm.
start a great startup, which is amazing. And it just means that all the investment we made for this is still there. Like 5 years later, these people are still, they know what the other teams are doing. They can kind of feel empathy for the challenges they are facing, and so it's I can extend that to, let's say, 12, 13 people in the initial
Mhm.
days. It's starting to feel pretty painful from the team coordination perspective at that point, but I
Right.
feel like the benefits really outweigh uh,
Yeah.
the cost of the friction.
When did again, day zero, everybody's reporting to you. When did you need to introduce managers into this? And how did that look at Swarmia? And how did that look at, you also mentioned Smartly, which is a very different context from where Swarmia is today. Yeah, how do you think about that management layer in an engineering organization?
Yeah, this is where a lot of the context about your organization comes into play. So things affecting this are, for example, you as a leader, what other responsibilities do you have? So I was the solo founder and CEO, so I had a lot of responsibilities outside of just engineering. So I had to keep that in mind. Then it's a question of what kind of talent do you have on your team? Do you already have manager talent on the team that could rise up for the job, or do you need to go and look elsewhere? Do you need to hire people from the outside for this job, because that's making it a little bit more difficult for everyone and maybe more expensive too. So those are maybe the main considerations. And at Smartly, we were a very young team, extremely fast growing. Like we went from 30 to 100 people in that couple of months after I joined. So the first thing I did was setting up a recruiting process and then an onboarding process. And then we just started executing on that. And spent definitely more than half of my time on recruiting. And that was very much the ZERB time for many of you, I'm sure.
Right.
And at that point, I was so focused on the recruiting and growing the team that really we were 30 people. I had 30 direct reports in my organization by the time we actually started to roll out the team leads. And I would definitely like to do that a lot sooner. It's weird if you're kind of introducing a singular layer, like I'm going to have one manager reporting to me and then there's a team reporting to them. No one wants to build these like stacked up organizations like that, but sometimes that's what you have to do. And in our case, we had Oskari, who is currently our head of engineering. He was also the first team lead for our engineering team. And because I had all these other responsibilities, I wanted to do that relatively early. So it was basically just one team with a team lead. And since I also had the sales and marketing side, I kind of got to outsource the team management side from engineering. And that turned out to be a great thing, because it's also one of those things that requires practice in any case, because if you have first-time managers, they're not going to be perfect managers the first time you promote them. And as an organization, you're not maybe ready for managers. Like people are rejecting all kinds of change and they don't necessarily like that change and so on. And so starting to practice it earlier just makes it easy to then adjust and learn. And if you do it when it's already too late, then there's already so many other things that are broken that it's really difficult to fix all of this at once. So I'm quite happy that at Swarmia we did it pretty early when we had, I don't know, like maybe 5 to 8 developers at that point. And at Smartly, we definitely did it too late when we had 30 developers at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about failure modes like in organizational design, because I think that's a it's a thing that if you haven't done it before, your instincts can lead you astray. Or kind of how you think it should work may be disconnected from what we've actually seen work in the past. So what are some failure modes that you see startups get into as far as their engineering teams?
Yeah, well, the general rule of thumb is that you should design the teams so that they are independently able to make progress on their most important objectives. And when you use that as a guiding principle, then you quickly see the type of failure modes kind of that end up slowing you down. And for example, going too far into that functional specification or like specialization might be one of the typical examples. So it's easier for everyone to be around people who are similar to them, who have a similar role and so on. Like there's less friction there. And so that means that you might end up having a front end team and a back end team. But now what happens is that when the company needs to do something like ship a feature, there is likely going to be a front end component, but there's likely going to be a back end component to it. So these teams at that point are not truly autonomous, because they actually have to coordinate with each other to align the front end and the back end. And so that just means that these teams are not able to kind of take on some complexity of your hands and deal with it. And instead you end up like having to manage that and having to project manage these things from the very beginning. So that's maybe the most typical one that I see. There's definitely all kinds of different ways, like starting from kind of not empowering the teams enough. That's maybe another thing, that if you have figured out the team boundaries well enough, then you should also have like the prioritization decisions, you should be able to push those to the teams, because there's too many details for you to care about. And so if you try to manage every single improvement, it just means that those improvements are not going to get done. While if there's a team that's responsible for this, who knows the pain, who gets enough context of why this is important, then they are likely able to make those small fixes here and there, and they're going to be able to reduce the complexity from the org level quite significantly. So that's maybe another thing that I'm thinking about. And then of course, finally, all of this is, as you scale, as a general rule of thumb, these early teams are very customer focused, very outcome focused, and so they are kind of product teams, as Marty Kagan would call them. But then at some point, they are going to start coming up with their own solutions for every single thing. And so you're going to have multiple CI providers, you're going to have multiple ways of doing this and that. And that's a failure mode that's difficult to quantify for many organizations, because it looks like everyone's doing some work, and they definitely are doing some work. But at the same time, you could have gotten there a lot faster if you just understood which parts to share between the teams and which parts to kind of let each team uniquely decide. So some kind of a platform team or some idea of doing some cross-cutting work across the teams is likely going to be required at some stage. And for us, that was the fourth team. So we started it after starting 3 product teams.
So we're close to the end of this. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them into the LinkedIn live chat, and we are happy to answer them, even if we need to go a couple minutes over. But maybe one last question from me in the meantime is, excuse me, what are things that are really hard to, what are mistakes that you can make, or maybe mistakes you have made that were really difficult to fix later?
Yeah, I think the funny thing about engineering is that even though a lot of the writing and everything is about the process and kind of the ways of working, in reality, it's just the quality of the decisions that matter. Like, and those decisions tend to be very company specific, they're very domain specific, and so on. So, like for example, at Flowdoc, one of the biggest mistakes we made, we built this team collaboration tool that was chat based, and one of the big mistakes we made, that we focused on teams almost exclusively, ignoring the organizational level. And so that meant that even on the technical level, we couldn't get real-time messages from a lot of different channels. They would be like a separate browser tab at that
Mhm,
point. And
mhm,
turns out that was extremely difficult to refactor afterwards. If you
mhm.
build something that streams messages for one channel and now you suddenly want to stream
Yeah,
it for multiple channels, it probably took us a
yeah.
year to fix that. And so, and actually it's funny because Slack did the same mistake, but per
Mhm,
organization. So when we fixed it, we actually fixed it properly, and then we got like multiple organizations already in one
mhm,
view. But Slack had this very same problem where each organization was actually a separate entity, and so Slack
mhm,
was basically consuming 5 times the memory if you had 5
mhm.
organizations you were a part
Right,
of.
right.
And
Mhm,
it was a multi-year project for them to fix this. And these are just the type of things where maybe if we understood our customers better and had a little bit more foresight to where this company is going to be going, because of course in the early days our customers were also startups, so they didn't have a big organization
right.
around them, so this wasn't a big problem. But maybe if we understood what's coming next, we would have been able to take that into account, and it would have been pretty easy to fix uh, at that point. But then turns out it just took us like took us a
Mhm,
really
mhm.
long time to do something about it later. And I feel like
Yeah.
similar things happen whether it's on your platform side or anything else. Like being able to predict the future is pretty difficult,
Mhm,
but you should still try, and you should bring all the perspectives that you have on the team so that you're as good at it as possible so that you can make good decisions all the time.
yeah. Any parting thoughts for our startup listeners about how to succeed in their engineering organizations?
Yeah, well, I will just want to go back to the original point where we started from. So, as a startup, Nothing else matters except product market fit in the early days, and then you do balance that with kind of your funding and time horizons. And so it's important to keep that in mind all the time, and it's really important to build a culture where people are quite focused on that. And then the other part is that, like, going to the last point about good decisions, uh, that is really about your decision making culture. So do we have a culture where people will bring up their concerns and where we debate respectfully about these topics so that we arrive in the best possible decisions? And ultimately, that's really what matters. All of these other like processes and tools, they are great tools, but that's all they are. So ultimately, it all starts from kind of where you decide as a company to focus.
Well, Alta, we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much for chatting about this. I learned things from before my Swarmia time, so really appreciate it. And we'll be back in the future for some more of these around some other topics about engineering organizations.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks for joining.